So at the end of every year, you guys probably already know this, you probably have seen some of my videos before, I just love recapping on older iPhones and just older phones in general and kind of seeing how they hold up in the later part of 2020. And I'm pretty much at this point where I'm kind of, reviewing the iPhone 5 now because I've already reviewed all the other iPhones. And what I can tell you is that there honestly hasn't been too much crazy news from even the beginning review that I made in the early on this year of the iPhone 5, but it's still such an important iPhone. And, even with the addition of the iPhone SE 2 and the iPhone 12 mini, that really showcased Apple's kind of desire and kind of, methodology, I guess, I don't know what the perfect word is, for something like a smaller iPhone. Now, when this phone came out back in 2012, this was the top tier phone at the time, I guess, from an Apple device. Apple only sold one iPhone every year at this point. They may have came out with like an iPhone 5C and 5S eventually, but as of this point, Apple, the iPhone 5 was the most expensive iPhone Apple made. And that was something that at that time was just, expected. iPhone 5 was a small iPhone, but all the other iPhones before that were small as well. And, whenever you compared this thing to like a Galaxy Note 2 or like an S3 or whatever the other phones were at the time, the biggest selling point for the other phones was that it was bigger. But one of the best selling points of the iPhone 5 was that it was smaller. Not everybody wants a bigger phone. And now we've kind of shifted to a more bigger size, but now we also have a smaller sized phone with the 12 mini. And I only bring that up because the iPhone 5's size was also small at that time. And to a lot of people, that may have been a pro. Now, it still has that 4-inch panel on the front, which resolution wise is still actually pretty decent. Even in the later part of 2020, I'll be completely honest, the panel itself isn't that horrible. It still turns on, it still looks pretty decent, the colors are okay. I personally probably wouldn't be okay using a phone this small, but I just don't think the screen is that bad on it. I just think everything surrounding the screen is really where the problem lies. So that's probably one little aspect of it, and nothing like that has changed from the beginning on this year. But you still have a lot of bezel around the display, which, like I said before, is perfectly fine, but it doesn't look bad. Like when you look at a phone like this, like I know I've seen a lot of bad phones in my lifetime. There's probably even phones, like honestly, I didn't even think the Razr phone, those ones, I didn't think those things looked that great. They look pretty outdated, but the iPhone 5 doesn't even look that outdated. It still looks pretty premium, and it still feels extremely premium as well. And that's something that really shocks me, without a doubt. And on the bottom, you have that lightning port, and this was the first iPhone to actually remove the 30-pin connector in addition to that lightning port. So that's something that was really cool for this phone, and that has held up extremely well. Had this thing had the same port as the iPhone 4S, then obviously things would have been a little different. But because this phone has that lightning pin connector, or the lightning connector, that's something that really future-proofed this phone because we're still using it. Eventually, I think with the iPhone 13, it's been rumored that we're going to remove it, but that's still something that's super impressive to me. And on the back, you have that glass back, on the top and bottom, but that aluminum back pretty much for like 85% of it. And without a doubt, this phone still feels extremely premium, and I've never said anything other than that. It still feels and looks like a very premium device. But on top of that back, you have that single camera setup. Now, this is something that really dates it for sure. It's an 8 megapixel sensor. You can do 1080p videos on it, and that's really it. I mean, there's no like 4K capability. There's no portrait mode. I don't even think this phone has slow-mo on it, but I think at the end of the day, the fact that it had a camera is pretty okay, and the fact that it still turns on for me a whole 8 years later, over 8 years at this time, is still really impressive, and I think that, deserves some credit for sure. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that even at that time it was the best camera, but what I do remember is that at that time, a lot of people were hyping this thing up and saying it was an amazing camera, and I looked back, there were a ton of camera comparisons happening back in 2012, even early 2013, so that's another pretty big thing to keep in mind. Again, I'm not going to sit here and say that phone was the perfect phone or perfect camera, but the fact that it had a really decent camera on it is really good. And on the front, you have that 1.2 megapixel front-facing camera, and you can do FaceTime calls on that and everything, and only 720p videos on that, and just seeing the evolution. Now we have the 4K at 60 on those iPhones, but at this time, we could only do even 1080p at 30 on the back, so that's another pretty big thing to keep in mind as well. But I think when it comes down to the whole entire camera experience, it probably gets a thumbs up for me even at this point. I don't think it's like the best or perfect camera as of this point, but it still holds up, and I think that deserves some credit too. So in terms of the camera setup, that pretty much covers it up. Software wise, it's pretty much completely outdated. It's not getting any more software versions. It stopped at iOS 10.3.3, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, iOS 10 apps are starting to be, dissupported. So what that means is that, basically apps are not going to be updated for the most part. And WhatsApp actually said that they're going to stop supporting apps, I think iPhones under iOS 9. The iPhone 5 for now isn't touched. but I think within the next year, a lot more apps are going to be unsupported for iOS 10, since I think iOS 11 changed up to that 64-bit architecture. So that means to me that a lot of manufacturers, a lot of app developers really just don't want to push updates anymore for these other devices. So if that happens, then we're probably going to see a huge uproar and a lot of devices not getting, support or app support and all that stuff. But that's beyond the fact. I really don't think that many people are using the iPhone 5 anyway, and a lot of these other app developers see that same thing. So in terms of software, that pretty much covers it up. Now, performance-wise, the iPhone 5 had that Apple A6 chip inside of it, a dual-core CPU, and 1 gigabyte of RAM on every single model that came out with it. Now, it did have that base 16 gig model, which I think was an increase from the last generation, but this was the first iPhone, I believe, that only had 1 gig of RAM. The ones before this, I think, had like half a gig of RAM, so this one had twice the amount of RAM as before, and I don't think we've ever seen a generation increase like that since I think the iPhone 6. So the 6 to the 6X actually got an extra gig, going from 1 gig to 2 gigs, but I don't think we've gotten another generation that increased the RAM by twice the amount since then, and I think that's pretty insane. I think with the iPhone 5 specifically, the performance isn't, this is what I'll tell you. For a 2012 phone being talked about in the later part of 2020, I think this phone's performance is actually pretty decent. I think it actually holds up extremely well. It's pretty smooth. It's definitely not the fastest thing, but it has a lot of capabilities still. I think, from going from one app to the other, if you had to do a lot of basic tasks on the specific iPhone, I feel like you'd be able to get through probably a majority of little tiny things. I think the problems start to lie if you specifically look at, the capability when it comes down to, basic things with iOS 14, like widgets and, keeping apps in the background for a little bit longer. I think that's what you kind of tend to see the problems arise at in these specific situations. I think when you have a phone like this, it's not going to be fast. It's not going to be expected. It's just going to be what you would expect in a way of a 2012 phone in 2020. Now, if a phone manufacturer were to release this type of performance in this day and age, even on a budget, $200 phone, I would be super shocked. I would just think the performance would not be that great. But I've seen a lot of manufacturers release phones in that $100 price tag that don't feel as premium as an iPhone 5, that don't have the type of performance as the iPhone 5, and frankly just don't even have the features or the stability as an iPhone 5. I bought a lot of, kind of budget tier phones from like Walmart and Best Buy, I think even throughout this year, that were like $30, $50, $100, and they weren't that good of phones, to be completely honest. The iPhone 5 in some ways is actually better. Now, I would rather have the most recent, most secure version of the phone, and I think that may be the Android as of this point, but the iPhone 5 still has a, pretty decent performance when it comes down to it. It just so happens that it's not that good of a performing phone, but you guys kind of expect that at this point. So in terms of performance, that pretty much covers it up. Now, ending it off with the battery life, this thing has a 1440 mAh battery. Now, the biggest asset about this battery is that it is pretty easy to, change out. So if you wanted to go ahead and replace this for a bigger size battery or whatever, you do have that capability with this, which I think is pretty important. So when it comes down to the battery life, it's not that great. You guys already know that, but that's pretty much how I'd expect to say. That's pretty much how I'd kind of sum it up. Now, to kind of sum up this video and to answer the question, should you go and pick up an iPhone 5 in the later part of 2020? I mean, absolutely not. I would not recommend anybody picking up this phone anymore. It's almost like a waste of money, but I will tell you, if you need kind of like a side device, if you need an iPhone that kind of, works as an iPod, you just want to use it to stream stuff off of and all that stuff, then I don't think the iPhone 5 is a horrible phone, but the jump from an iPhone 5 to the iPhone 5S was a humongous jump in my opinion. You were getting a much more stable phone, and that phone is still getting software support, believe it or not. Even though that phone came out in 2013, it is still getting software support, which is very, very impressive. So when it comes down to that type of thing, the iPhone 5S is definitely going to do you much better than an iPhone 5. But honestly, I just don't think anybody's watching this video and telling themselves like, oh, should I actually still buy an iPhone 5? It's just kind of intriguing because in the back of your mind, you're like, well, if I wanted to, I could probably end up using it, because even me, I'm sitting here, I have an iPhone 12 Pro I use as a main phone, but when I look at an iPhone 5 and I feel it and I use it, if I really had to, if I had no other choice really, I would use the iPhone 5, and I really don't think I would care that much, and that's a huge thing for Apple, the, support, the stability, and the longevity of an iPhone, is even including an iPhone 5, is super impressive to me. Now, I'm not going to enjoy the experience, I just don't think I would complain, I think, as much as I would complain and using a comparable 2012 Android device. So looking at the alternative, I definitely do think the iPhone 5 is actually one of the best phones that has held up extremely well, especially from 2012. I think maybe a contender would be like a Galaxy Nexus or a Nexus 4, whichever phone came out. I don't remember what came out in 2012, but that would be the only other phone I would put on the same level. But I think the iPhone 5 has held up extremely well, and that's pretty much how I'd sum it up. If you guys have any other questions or anything, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. Every single subscriber that we get really does count, so it means so much if you guys can hit that. Also check out the other links down in the description as well. My Twitter, my Instagram, my other channels. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.